Okay, so quickly, just to review sort of in one sentence, each of the last three chapters before we go to chapter 4. Chapter 1 was sort of an introduction. He also laid out the concept that there are two souls, and we focused a little bit on the natural soul, or what we're going to call the animal soul, biological soul, all synonyms for the same energy. Chapter 2, we spent time discussing the godly soul. It's essentially a part of God. And that was chapter 1 and 2, the two souls. And then we get to chapter 3 last week. And chapter 3, we discussed what is a soul. In other words, what is the personality? What is the makeup of the soul? And what we defined, we said, look, there's 10 soul powers. Call it attributes, call it spirot, call it what you want. And generally, those attributes those 10 attributes divide into 3 and 7, intellectual and emotional. And if I had to ask you, what is your soul? So it's actually not the core of your soul. The core of your soul is a part of God, and we'll define what that means later on in chapter 18. But if I ask you, what's the personality of your soul? So I say my soul is my perspective, my awareness, how I view the world, both intellectually and emotionally. What makes me different than you is that I view the world differently. My perspective is different, and therefore what stimulates me emotionally is different, right? You like chocolate ice cream, and I like vanilla ice cream. We respond to different phenomenon based on our emotional makeup. So there's this. So in other words, chapter 3 is you want to know what is the core, what is the soul, what's the personality of the soul, and we say the soul is the 10 attributes. We got into the first 3, Chachma, Bina, Dat, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and we spoke about the function of each of those because that's very important for the theme of the book. But that was chapter 3. Now we get to chapter 4. And chapter 4 is also extremely important to understand. In other words, it's foundational to figure out exactly it's foundational to Rabbi Shneur Zalman's entire thesis. And what is the theme of chapter 4? Chapter 4 begins and says that in addition to the soul, which has 10 soul powers, 10 sfirot, the soul also has what we call garments. And we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the garments. And garments are going to play a critical role in, like I said, in the entire thesis of the book, in the entire perspective of the book, and how we redefine the terms of righteous, wicked, and the average person, the intermediary, which, as we will say later, is sort of the path for most people, for the average person. Not average person, but most people. Okay, so what is a garment? And how does a garment, what is a garment? And what is a garment, and what are the garments of the soul? So the first thing we want to look at the metaphor of a garment. What does a garment do for you? So on one hand, a garment, I guess the first thing to think about of a garment is that it is not you. It's not your essence. It does, however, allow you to express yourself and relate to the people outside of you, to the world outside. Either you have to wear a garment for modesty. You may have to wear a garment because it's too cold outside, so you need a coat. Whatever the case is, the garments is the tools that you use to express yourself to the outside world, but it's not you. And therefore, the most interesting feature about the garment is that it's actually very easy to change. You get home, you don't like this garment, you change it, you buy a new garment. Multi-billion-dollar industry is the garment industry, of course, because they're always trying to get you to buy a new garment. But in any case, the garments are changeable and they serve you, they're not who you are. Okay, what does this mean for the garments of the soul? So as Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to say, the garments of the soul is 3 garments of the soul. Now it's easier to understand it about the first 2, but it applies to all 3. So we'll talk about that. Garments of the soul is thought, speech, and action. The thoughts that I'm thinking, the words that I say, and the things that I do. Why do we refer to them as garments? For two reasons. First of all, they're not who I am, right? What I feel is who I am. What I love is who I am. That's a soul power. What I understand, the way I perceive reality, that's who I am. What I do is not who I am. I could do something that's exactly the opposite of what I am, of how I feel, right? I could hate you and I could still send you a birthday card. That's an action. So it's not me. It's a garment. It's the way I interact with the world outside of me. That's action. Same thing with speech. I could feel one thing and say the opposite. It's not a problem. I could say I love you and I don't love you. No problem. It doesn't cost me money. Why? Because again, speech is not me. It's a tool that I use to express myself, but it's not me. And therefore, I could change the garment. I could be talking about the news in one moment, talking about philosophy in the next moment. And also I could cease to talk altogether, just like I could cease to act altogether. Now, even the third garment, which what the Kabbalah will refer to is, that is the garment that is united with the soul, because thought is very interesting. Thought is a garment in the sense that it's not me. I could think about things that are inconsistent to me. I don't like broccoli, but I could think about the virtues of broccoli, okay? But thought is unique because thought is a garment, but I always have to wear the garment of thought. The thought is constantly moving, constantly roaming. A person is always thinking. You can't turn off your thought. Maybe meditation, it's very hard, it's very difficult. Even that, I'm not sure you actually are thinking about nothing, but that's another story. The bottom line is you're always thinking. But it is considered a garment in the sense that it's very relatively easy to change what you're thinking about, right? I'm thinking about something that's making me uncomfortable. I have the power to speak about something else. Sometimes I don't feel like I have the power, but I have the power. That's what I tell my children when they say, I'm having bad dreams. What am I going to say? What am I going to do for you? I say, think about something else. They say, I can't. I say, you could, right? Who's right? I don't know. I think I'm right, but what do I know? The bottom line, they're not studying enough Tanya. No, I'm kidding. The bottom line is the garment of thought is a garment in the sense that it's a united garment. It's a garment the soul always has to wear something when it comes to thought. But again, it's not me. I could think about words and ideas that are inconsistent with myself. It's not a problem. Now, compare that to emotions, for example. Emotions are much harder to change. You can't come in and say, oh, you don't love God? Okay, love God. Oh, you love something negative? Stop loving it. It doesn't work that way. Because this is who I am. And if I could change, maybe I could, maybe I can't. If I could change, even if I could change to a certain degree, it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort, right? It's like I have to go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, you got to change your lifestyle. So, okay, so I have to go to the gym. I have to change my diet. Things take time. You can't change yourself overnight, but a garment is no problem. You don't like this garment, take it off. So we're going to now spend some time about the garments and specifically about the garments of the godly soul. But the big idea, I'll give you a spoiler alert. The big idea here is, what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to pivot toward, is that ultimately in the big picture, what is the mission of a person? Not necessarily to change how you feel. Don't change how you feel, at least not initially. Yet most people are not going to be able to transform how they feel. But what is the domain of the person, and what a person has complete control, is the garments, thought, speech, and action. Here, you can think about whatever you want. You can talk about whatever you want. You can do whatever you want, even things that are inconsistent with the way I feel right now. And this is going to be a critical point to the entire book of the Tanya, right? Because remember, if you go back to the introduction, part of the problem is people were trying to grow spiritually. People were trying to become close to God. They were trying to become spiritual or holy. And after 30 years of trying to become holy, they realize that they have desires that are negative. So they say, oh, obviously everything I'm trying to do is a waste of time. And the answer is, in some sense, yes, if what you're trying to do is change your emotions completely to make them only holy, not everybody can do that. In fact, most people cannot do that. What is your responsibility? What does God want of you? Not that you shouldn't have any negativity in your heart, but rather that your thought, speech, and action should be positive and healthy and constructive. So that's going to be a big idea throughout the entire book, at least the beginning of the book. In other words, this is the big thesis, but we're not there yet. So far, we're just examining the godly soul, and we said the godly soul in chapter 3. We said we have we have 10 soul powers, and now we introduce the 3 garments. Now, for the godly soul, the way the garments look, what are the garments of the godly soul? So garments is the way you express yourself. Godly soul is part of God. How does the godly soul express itself? How does it express its connection to God in this world? So the way it does that is thought, speech, and action of the Torah. Because that's how it expresses its identity, by connecting to the Torah, to God's will. So when a person thinks thoughts of Torah, is thinking about the wisdom of the Torah, when a person speaks words of Torah, words of prayer, Or when a person does the actions that the Torah dictates, that is thought, speech, and action. And that is how the soul expresses its inner identity. Its inner identity is that it's part of God. And that's the big idea. Well, that's the first idea of the chapter. Any questions, please share. Otherwise, we go to the second and third idea. And then if we have time, we'll hopefully make a dash and try to read it all inside. But that's the first big idea. The big idea is that you have, in addition to the soul powers, which is much harder to change, and this is your personality, thought, speech, and action are garments, relatively easy to change. And garments this is how the soul expresses itself. And for the godly soul, it expresses itself by thought, speech, and action of the Torah. Okay. Now we're going sort of parenthetically. You want to start thinking about what does it mean, the thought, speech, and action of the Torah. So usually what you would say is, what's more important, me or my garments? I'm on a higher level. I'm me. I'm higher level, and my garment serves me. Because my garment serves me, I'm greater. But that is not in fact true when it comes to the garments of the soul. Because what are the garments of the soul? The garments of the soul is the Torah. In other words, is God's wisdom. God's wisdom is greater than the soul. It's on a higher level than the soul. So this is very interesting. It's sort of a paradox. Although the Torah is how the soul expresses itself, and the commandments is how the soul expresses the fact that it's part of God, but it wants to express itself as part of God, right? Because you have to understand, not every garment expresses you. Let's say you are what's the word I'm looking for? Let's say you have a unique taste of this and design, and you put on a garment that's unique to you. Oh, so you say, this garment expresses me. But if you just put on a generic shirt, that doesn't really express who your true core. So too, garments express who I am in some sense. So the godly soul, to express its identity, which is part of God, needs to have garments that could express it. What are the garments that can express it? The Torah and the mitzvot. Okay. But the Torah and the mitzvot are actually God's wisdom. So in some sense, in the analog, the garments are actually greater than the soul itself. So we'll get to that as well. That's part 2. And part 3 of the chapter is actually very interesting. Part 3 of the chapter is the notion as follows. So we talk about garments and we talk about the soul itself. The soul itself is the soul powers, the feeling and emotion, the feeling and understanding. And then you have the garments, which is thought, speech, and action. Now, when does the soul truly feel and understand God? Not in this world, in the world to come. In Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, what is paradise from the Jewish perspective? Paradise is the place where the godly soul could understand and feel love to God in a very intense way. Okay, so I would say that the world to come is the ultimate. That's where you want to go. You want to feel connected to God, and you want to understand God, right? That's sort of the realm of connect to God with your soul powers. But here, the sages say, no. Judaism has a fascinating idea. Judaism says 1 hour of good deeds in this world is greater than all the reward in the world to come. We discussed this when we talked about the Song of Songs. Why so? Because what is the reward? The reward is, the soul understands and feels God. But God is infinite. You can't really truly feel God, and you can't truly understand the essence of God. So all you're getting in paradise is a ray of God. However, in this world, through the garments, thought, speech, and action of the Torah, you get God's essence. And here is one last point. God's essence. I open up the Talmud. That's God's essence. My cow gores your cow. I have to pay you, or I don't have to pay you. That's the essence of God's wisdom. How could that be? It's physical, not spiritual. So here Rabbi Shneur Zalman employs an unbelievable parable. The parable is, first of all, the kernel of the idea, this is God's wisdom, but it expresses itself in this world in a physical way, right? So for example, let's say you have an algorithm. So the algorithm is true about some spiritual concept, but that same algorithm could be applied in the physical sense. Now, I understand the physical application of the algorithm, but the algorithm is truly, but I'm really in some sense grasping the essence, which is the algorithm, but the way it can be applied in other areas. So the metaphor that Rabbi Shneur Zalman uses is a very physical metaphor. A person is hugging the king. Now, does it make a difference if you hug a king, if the king is wearing only a shirt or only a sweater or only a jacket? It doesn't matter. Because if you're hugging the king, you're embracing the king, even though you say, I'm not hugging the king, I'm hugging the king's garment. It doesn't matter if you're hugging the king's garment. Within the garment is the king himself. So in other words, when I study Torah or I do the mitzvah, yes, I'm engaging with something physical, but within that physical object or that physical idea is only a garment, and it contains the essential wisdom of God. And that's why specifically, this is the big theme of the chapter, that the garments, the thought, speech, and action, in some sense, when it comes to the godly soul's thought, speech, and action, the thought, speech, and action of the Torah actually elevate the soul higher than what it can get to through its own soul powers, which is understanding God and feeling God. So in some sense, chapter 4 is a celebration of the garments, and how the garments in some ways, unlike in the metaphor in the person where your body is more important than your garments, in the spiritual sense, the garments of the godly soul have a certain advantage over the godly soul herself. So this is really the three sections of the chapter. To summarize very quickly in under 60 seconds, hopefully. First, we introduce the concept of the thought, speech, and action, which are garments. They're garments in the sense that they're not your essence. I could do things that are inconsistent with the way I feel or the way I understand. I could speak words that are inconsistent with the way I feel. Very easy to change the thought and speech and action, much harder to change my own perspective and how I feel. So those are the garments, point number one. And the garments of the godly soul is thought, speech, and action of the Torah and the mitzvot. I think words of Torah, I speak words of Torah, I do what the Torah says. That's the thought, speech, and actions. That's how the soul uses garments to express its inner identity. Its inner identity is the fact that it's essentially part of God. Okay, for part number one. Then we have to clarify, because here there's the difference between the physical garments and the spiritual garments. The spiritual garment, and when we talk about the spiritual garments of the soul, the thought, speech, and action of the Torah are on a greater level than the soul itself, because they are an expression of the divine will and wisdom. Even though what we're studying, the Torah that we're doing and the mitzvah that we're doing is in a physical, yes, but within that physical garment lies the body of the king. So when you're going to hug somebody, you're not going to say, "Oh, I'm not as close because I'm hugging your physical shirt and not you." No, I'm hugging you. You happen to be in the shirt, but I'm hugging you. And that's the bond that we get through studying of the Torah and doing the physical commandments. So that's in short the theme of chapter 4. Anybody has comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, we'll try to read it inside. And again, like I alluded to earlier, this idea, the thought, speech, and action, which is the domain and the realm where a person does have absolute and complete control, that is the arena that is our life and our mission on earth to get control. In other words, to be healthy in our thought, speech, and action. Our essential feelings, that is much more difficult. And that's not only more difficult, that's not really what God wants of us, as we will see and as we will play out for at least the next, 30 chapters or so. Okay, this is the story in short. Okay, one more. This Rabbi Shneur Zalman doesn't mention here, but it's an interesting idea, so I'll put it in here. Hopefully I'll just do it in 2 minutes, and then we can go to the Tanya. Thought, speech, and action. You could think of thought, speech, and action as ways to interact with the person outside of you. As we mentioned, that's what the garment is, but it's actually progressive. So if you think about it in the sense that it evolves. In other words, in my relationship with you, I'm going to need thought, speech, and action. And ultimately, ironically, if I ask you what's a greater level, thought, speech, and action, in some sense, when it comes to a relationship, action is greater. So here's what I mean. What is thought? When I say relationship, I mean, how do I relate to you? Okay, so I'm planted within myself. I'm in myself. Now I want to relate to you. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to think about you. Okay, and I think about you means I have this picture of what you are within myself, but it's still within myself. So I could think whatever I want. I could think you're a nice person. You're not a nice person. It doesn't really matter, right? I have an idea that you're perfect. You're not, but it doesn't matter. It's my thought. In my thought, even though I'm thinking about you, but I'm thinking about you on my own terms. So I'm starting to move toward you, but I'm still within myself. That's in the world of thought. World of speech, Here I have to meet up with you. I have to meet. It's 50% me, 50% you. How do I know? Because speech is not just about moving your lips and saying words. Speech means you have to understand what I'm saying. If I speak Japanese and you speak French, we're not going to communicate. Speech means I understand that you are here, not the way you are in my mind, but you're a person in this world. You have your own set of ideas, and I have to communicate with you on your terms. So that's why I say it's 50-50, because speech is I'm expressing myself. What do I speak about? I'm speaking about either an emotion or an idea, my idea or my emotion. So I'm expressing myself, but I'm expressing myself to you. So here it's both me and you coming together. Action is where I could do something for you and not for me at all. That means going beyond myself completely and connecting to you, and you're the center. So in speech, I am still the center. I'm thinking about you, but I'm thinking about you the way you are on my terms. Speech is 50-50. We need to communicate. I'm expressing myself to you. And action, actually, I can get to even a bigger level in the relationship, which is, it's not about me, it's about you. I'm going to do something for you, even though for me, I don't need to do that. I don't need it. And that's how I relate to the person outside of me, to the world outside of me. So thought, speech, and action is not only 3 different ways of expressing yourself, but it's actually ultimately, it's 3 stages in relating to the person with whom you want a relationship. So that's not explained in this chapter, but I thought that was interesting. Okay, now we're going to jump in and read the Tanya. I think for today we'll try the lessons in Tanya, which is more elaborate. We'll see how it goes. And then we'll make a decision. Okay. Okay, so we're not going to read the paragraphs that are in the gray section. We're just going to try to get through the actual text. And you see if you could see the text, some is bold, and that's the actual translation. And then there's between the bold words, that's the sort of putting in commentary to make it more readable. So we'll try our best. Don't hesitate to stop me, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so chapter 4. In addition to the 10 faculties discussed in chapter 3, every divine soul possesses 3 garments. What are the garments? The garments are thought, speech, and action, as they find expression in the 613 commandments of the Torah. Later, we'll talk about the garments of the animal soul. But right now, we're still thought, speech, and action of godly soul. In other words, thought, speech, and action that can express the essence of the godly soul. And that's thought, speech, and action of the Torah. What does that mean? So he explains, for when a person actively fulfills all the precepts which require physical action, example, when he dons tefillin or fulfills the commandment of tzitzit, etc. And with his power of speech, he occupies himself in expounding all the 613 commandments and laws governing their fulfillment. So he studies Torah with his mouth, and with his power of thought, he comprehends all that he is capable of understanding in the Pardes. Pardes is an acronym. Pardes means an orchard, but it's also an acronym for the 4 levels of the Torah. Pshat, Remez, Yesod. There's four general ways of understanding Torah. So when a person does this, in other words, he expresses his thoughts in the words of Torah, speech in the words of Torah, and action doing the commandments, then all of his soul's 613 organs are clothed in the 613 commandments of the Torah. So according to the Talmud, the person has 613 organs. Again, it depends how you classify. There's organs and 248 organs and 365 sinews, and together you get 613, and that corresponds to the 613 commandments. In other words, every commandment sort of expresses one part of the soul, of the body also, but also of the soul. The body has 613 organs, and so does the soul. Okay, we don't want to get into that too detailed, but in any case, specifically, the Chabad of his soul, meaning his intellectual faculties, are clothed in the comprehension of the Torah, which he comprehends in the level of Pardes of the Torah to the extent of his mental capacity and according to the supernal root of his soul. In other words, we say the garments express me. What is me? My wisdom, understanding, knowledge. My 10 faculties. So let's start with the first 3. A person's wisdom is expressed through thinking the words of the Torah. How much does a person understand? Depending on how much I can understand based on the level of my soul. The midot, in other words, namely the emotions of fear and love of the Almighty, together with their offshoots and ramifications, in other words, all 7 categories of emotions, are clothed in the fulfillment of the commandments in deed and in word, meaning in the study of Torah, which is the equivalent of all the commandments. In other words, when I study Torah or I do a mitzvah, why am I doing it? I'm doing it because it's motivated by my love to God. Then that action is the garment that expresses my feeling, right? If you say, you love me, buy me flowers, I don't even have to say, I love you. And as a result, I go and I buy you flowers. So it's not just the flowers, it's not just the garment, but the garment expresses my feeling. And that's what we're saying. That's the power of the garment. So when a person studies Torah, he's expressing the wisdom of his godly soul. When a person does the acts of the Torah, does the commandments, studies the Torah and does the commandments, he's expressing the emotions of his godly soul. As he explains here, for love is the root of a Jew's observance of all 248 positive commandments. From it they issue forth, and without it they have no true substance. For he who fulfills them in truth is he who loves God's name and who truly desires to cleave to him. Now, one cannot truly cleave to him except through the fulfillment of the 248 positive commandments. In other words, we're saying, well, everything the Torah says to do, it's not a list of rules. It's a list of garments, a list of opportunities that allow you to express your love to God. Because the mitzvot are actually just expressions that express your love. Because why do you do the mitzvah? Motivated by love. For they are the 248 organs of the King, of God, King of the universe, as it were, as explained elsewhere. Every mitzvah is also corresponds to one of God's organs. We don't want to get into that. We'll get into that in chapter, is it 23, I think? Okay. So that's the positive. The positive mitzvot are motivated by the love. And then the negative mitzvot are motivated by the fear or the awe. He discusses the fear and the awe, right? What is the 2 primary emotions? I want to come close to you. I want to do what you want me to do. That's a feeling of closeness. Then the other thing is, the other primary emotion is awe. I'm repelled. I go away from things that make me uncomfortable or make you uncomfortable. And therefore, I don't do any of the things that the Torah says not to do out of fear or awe. Fear is the root of one's observance of the 365 prohibitive commandments. For he, the God-fearing person, will feel fear to rebel against the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he. By acting in defiance of his will, he will therefore refrain from anything that God forbade. So that's one level. That's the lowest level of fear. I'm afraid of God. There's a deeper level of fear, and that fear means awe, not fear. Or a deeper level of fear that he feels ashamed before God's greatness, so that he will not rebel against the all-seeing eyes of his glory by doing what is evil in his eyes, namely any of the abominable things hated by God, which are the klipot and sitra achra, the other side, which draw their nurture from the man below in this world and have their hold in him, so that they be able to derive their nurture and life through him, through his violation of the 365 prohibitive commandments. This idea we'll talk about later. When a person violates the Torah, he's adding energy to the klipa, to the unholy, but we'll talk about that later in chapter 8. Okay, so that's the first section. What's the first section? We said a person, in addition to the capacities of the soul, the 10 soul powers that define who you are, you also have garments. What are the garments? The garments of thoughts are thought, speech, and action. And in the context of the godly soul, we're talking about the thought, speech, of action of the Torah and the mitzvot. When a person follows the Torah, uses the Torah as tools to express what his godly soul understands and feels. That's section 1. Now we have to deal with this issue. It's funny because these garments are actually on a greater level than the soul. So we're going to deal with that right now. We're going to deal with that right now. Now, these 3 garments deriving from the Torah and its commandments, though they are called merely garments of the nefesh, ruach, and neshama, even though they're garments of the soul, nevertheless, their quality, the quality of the garments of the Torah and its commandments is infinitely higher and greater than that of the nefesh, ruach, and neshama themselves. Nefesh, ruach, and neshama are just 3 names of different levels of the souls. For as it explained in the Zohar, Torah and the Holy One, blessed be he, are entirely one. So if the Torah and God is one, so if you grasp the Torah, you're grasping God. This means, since Torah is the wisdom and will of the Holy One, blessed be he, I'm skipping to the bold, it is one with his glory and essence. Since he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, as explained above in chapter 2, in the name of Maimonides, So the bottom line is, at these three precepts, the bottom line is, because God and the Torah are one, so if you grasp the Torah, you're grasping God himself. And if you do what the Torah says, you're also grasping God himself. Now we're going to deal with the question of, how could that be? God is infinite. How could me studying a law of if my ox scores your ox, this is the law, how does that capture the divine wisdom, especially if you say the divine wisdom is one with God, but God is infinite. If God is infinite, how could I grasp God by understanding something physical? So this is the challenge that we have to deal with. Although the Holy One, blessed be he, is called Ein Sof, infinite, and his greatness can never be fathomed, and no thought can comprehend him at all. These are various verses. And so are with his will and his wisdom, infinite and unfathomable. As it is written, there is no searching of his understanding. We can never search, never hope to reach God's wisdom. And it is also written, when you will search to understand God, will you find? And it is further written, for my thoughts are not like your thoughts, says God to man. In other words, here we have so many verses implying that God is infinite. Not only God is infinite, but also his wisdom is infinite. So how could it be that we say that when we study Torah, which is obviously a finite idea, we study one law of the Torah, we're grasping God himself. God is infinite. So here's a beautiful concept. Concerning this disparity between human intelligence and divine wisdom, our sages have said, where you find the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be he, there you find his humility. So this is a beautiful idea. This is a Talmudic statement from Megillah that says like this. If you look in scripture, and anywhere scripture says that God is great, it also discusses God's humility. So for example, if the Torah says, I am totally infinite and aloof and sublime. But then the verse would say, yet God says, I dwell with the person who is humble and downtrodden, right? So it says God is great, and then it says, yes, but he goes and gets involved to do the judgment of the widow and the orphan. In other words, wherever you see God's greatness, you also see God's humility. Now, the Kabbalistic understanding of that phrase is a little bit different, but just as interesting. God is great. The expression of God's greatness is that he can express himself in the finite world. Because if you say God is infinite, and therefore he can't express himself in a limited way, then that itself is a limitation. If you say God is relegated to the realm of the infinity, then that is itself is a limitation. Then it's a catch-22. If he must be infinite, then he's not infinite. But if God, who is infinite, is truly infinite, if he can do whatever he wants, he can also express himself in a finite way. When you think about his greatness, that's also his humility. The greater he is, the more he can express himself in a finite idea. And that is the Torah, as we will see. God compressed his will and wisdom in the 613 commandments of the Torah and its laws, not only in the laws, but also in the stories of the Torah and the letter combinations of scripture, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. And God's will and wisdom are also contained in the exposition of these verses found in the Agadot and Midrashim of our sages of blessed memory. In other words, God takes his infinity and compresses it into a finite formula, either a law or the formation of the story, the choice of words of the story, or the commentary of the story. That's why God compresses his wisdom into a finite idea. Why does he do so? He does so we can relate to him. In all these, did God compress his will and wisdom in order that every neshama, or even the lower soul levels of ruach hanefesh, situated as they are in the human body, will be able to grasp with his intellect, and in order that the soul, fulfill them as far as they can be fulfilled in action, speech, and thoughts, thereby clothing itself with all its 10 faculties in these 3 garments of the thought, speech, and action of Torah and mitzvot. Beautiful. Now we say that's why the sages say that Torah the verse always refers to Torah as water. Why the metaphor of water? Therefore, the Torah has the Torah been compared to water. For just as water descends from a higher level to a lower level, right? Some things is fire goes upward, water falls down. So just like the Torah descends, just like water descends, as we find in the analogy of water, so has Torah descended from its place of glory, i.e. the lofty spiritual plane, which is its source. In its original state, it is God's will and wisdom, and Torah is one and the same with God, whom no thought can comprehend at all. On that plane, Torah is incomprehensible to man, as is God himself. From there, the Torah has journeyed in a descent through hidden stages, stage after stage, in the Hishtalshalut of the worlds, i.e., the chain-like order of interconnected spiritual worlds explained more fully in chapter 2. Torah descended through all these levels until it clothed itself in the material matters and things of this corporal world, which comprise nearly all of the Torah commandments and their laws. And thus the Torah clothed itself in the material objects which with the mitzvot are performed, and also in the physical letter combinations written with ink and in a book, namely the 24 books of the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Why does the Torah come down? Torah underwent this great descent so that every human thought be able to grasp them, and so that even speech and action, which are on a level lower than thought, be able to grasp them, God's will and wisdom, and clothe themselves in them by performing the commandments in speech and action. Okay. This is, I think, number 2, the second section, and that we explain that although it's a garment, and although we say usually in a physical sense, the garment is not as great as the person, but in the spiritual sense, the garment that allows the soul to express its connection to God, which is the Torah and the mitzvot, those garments are actually part of God, and therefore they are on a higher level than the soul. Now, how could a physical object of a mitzvah? Every mitzvah is about something physical. Every part of Torah is understanding something physical. How does that express the essence of God? So we say, because God compressed himself into the physical Torah and mitzvot. Why did he do so? So we can have a relationship with him, so we can be able to grasp him. And here we get to the third part. And the third part is going to be, that's why when a person is engaged with the Torah and the commandments, he is completely united and connected with God. Because the garments of the Torah, the thought, speech, and action, are an expression of God's essence. So when I'm surrounded by by the garments, I'm actually surrounded by God. God is embracing me. And we'll see later what it means that I embrace God. That's chapter 5. We'll leave that for next week. In any case, now, since Torah and its commandments clothe all the 10 faculties of the soul, and all of the soul's 613 organs from head to toe, head to foot, i.e. from its highest levels, its head, to its lowest levels, the soul, is truly completely bound up with God in the bond of life. And the very light of God envelops and clothes it from head to foot. So it is written, God is my rock in whom I take refuge. Refuge means we're sort of God is surrounding us. And naturally, only that which surrounds a person can protect him. And it is further written, as with a shield, God will surrounds him, meaning his will and wisdom that are clothed in Torah and his commandments. So when we say all the verses that say God is shielding me and protecting me, it means God is surrounding me. How's God surrounding me? Because I am surrounded by the garments of God. What are the garments? Thought, speech, and action. And now we have this beautiful idea, how in Judaism, even though in paradise we could understand God and we could love God, but that's not as powerful as this world where we don't see God and we don't necessarily feel God, but where we can do a mitzvah. And this is in Chabad philosophy, this is the superiority of the action over feeling and understanding. And this is beautiful. Here we go. For this reason, it has been said, and this is in the Ethics of the Fathers, so it's in the Mishnah, 1 hour of repentance and good deeds in this world is better than the whole life of the world to come. I guarantee you there's no religion that says that. 1 hour of doing something good in this world is better than the whole world to come. To the contrary, all the religions are saying, if you behave and you are moral in this world, then you get the reward. What's the reward? The world to come. Judaism says no. The world to come is very exciting, but 1 hour of life in this world is more important than all the world to come. Why? For the reward in the world to come consists of enjoying the radiance of the divine presence, only a ray, only a ziv, only a ray. It is the pleasure derived from comprehension of godliness, right? So that's the realm of the soul powers. Your soul, your wisdom understands God's greatness. The problem with that is we can never understand God's greatness. We can only understand a ray of his greatness. Now, no created being, even a spiritual being of the higher realms, such as angels of souls, can comprehend any more than a glimmer of the divine light. For this reason, the reward of the soul in the world to come is referred to as the radiance of the divine presence, ziv hashchina, the radiance of the divine presence, because we cannot understand the essence of the divine presence. But as for the essence of the glory of the Holy One, blessed be He, no thought can apprehend him at all. Only when it apprehends and clothes itself in Torah and mitzvot does it grasp and clothe itself in God himself. for the Torah and the Holy One, blessed be He, are one and the same. Okay. Now we have the beautiful metaphor. Although the Torah has been clothed in lowly material things, and it is only these material things that man's intellect grasps when studying Torah, not the essence of God's will and wisdom, it is by way of an illustration like one who embraces a king. And this is beautiful. There is no difference in the degree of closeness and attachment to the king, whether he embraces him when the king is wearing one robe or many robes, since the king's body is in them. Similarly, when the king embraces one with his arm, though it is dressed by his robes. He's saying both ways, when I embrace the king or when the king embraces me. As it is written, his God right hand embraces me. What does God's right hand mean? Which refers to Torah, called the right hand, because Torah was given by God's right hand. The Torah is related to the attribute of chesed, kindness, and water. That's the connection between right hand and Torah. Okay, so we read very quickly, and some of this is very mystical. I hope somebody will ask some questions so we can clarify. But the big picture here is, again, the big picture, what we know now that we didn't know yesterday, is that in addition to the soul, what is my soul, the godly soul? What is a soul? Soul means the 10 soul powers, what I understand and what I feel, that's a soul. The soul also has garments, and garments is what I think, what I speak, and what I do, thought, speech, and action that expresses who I am. And for the godly soul, thought, speech, and action that expresses who it is, what is the godly soul, part of God, it's the thought, speech, and action of the Torah. And when the godly soul invests itself in thought, speech, and action of the Torah, it is actually embracing God. Well, really, God is embracing it, as we will see. God is embracing it because I'm invested in the thought, speech, and action of the Torah. Everything I do is I'm fulfilling the commandments of the Torah. I'm speaking the words of Torah. I'm thinking the thoughts of the Torah. God is embracing me. That's a great union. And that union actually can happen more in this world than in the world to come, because the world to come, they don't have the Torah. They just have the divine wisdom. They just have, you understand the greatness of God. But my ability to understand the essence of God is compromised, severely compromised, because I cannot understand infinity. However, in this world is where God invested himself within the Torah and the commandments. And therefore, here I could actually connect to God through the garments of the Torah and the mitzvot. So that is the story in short. I hope we didn't go too fast. If we did, don't worry, we'll continue next week. In other words, the first time, we'll come back again next time around. The first time of the Tanya, we want to try to get a bird's eye view. So just to summarize again, chapter 1, godly soul, chapter 1, animal soul, chapter 2, godly soul, chapter 3, 10 soul powers, chapter 4, 3 garments of thought, speech, and action. And then chapter 5, we're going to talk about the Torah, because we got into the Torah, we'll talk about the Torah. And then once we get to chapter 6, 7, and 8, we focus on the animal soul. And then number 9 is the interaction between the godly soul and the animal soul. And that's where the tension begins. So that's the story in short. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I had a few questions. The first one, first of all, thank you very much. It was like a bird's eye view, but it was amazing ideas.
Thank you.
My first, and also very well structured and presented. But my first question is that this chapter indirectly describes the purpose of creation, because only through the mitzvot in this world you can actually connect to the essence. That's my first question.
Can we do one at a time? So, because I have bad memory. Let's do one at a time.
Okay.
It does not yet describe the purpose of creation, because the purpose of creation is going to be described in chapter 35. Ironically, the purpose of creation is not for my soul to connect to God. There's a broader purpose. But you're right. This chapter does identify, I'm not going to say the purpose, but a tremendous advantage for the soul in the creation. In other words, if you stop your soul, if you stop a soul and say, where would you rather be? Would you rather be in heaven? Or would you rather be on earth? So that's a trick question, because where is the soul more comfortable? Soul is more comfortable in heaven. Where is the soul more in pain? On earth, as we're going to speak about. But where could the soul have a deeper connection to God? That's on earth. So you're right. This paragraph does identify as superiority of the soul being in this world over heaven. So it is an advantage of creation. But I wouldn't say it's the advantage, the purpose, because the purpose of creation is going to be spelled out in chapter 36. And that's going to be consistent with the ideas, and that's so it's a purpose. It's a purpose.
Well, one of the aspects, because we cannot know, because we cannot grasp the idea, the source of desire of creation of the world. So it's just one of the aspects.
One of the aspects, but it's not the one that the Tanya, that Kabbalah philosophy identifies as the ultimate purpose. But it is certainly a superiority of creation. Yes. An advantage of creation. Yes.
Right. Okay. So my second question is not more of a comment. It's a beautiful metaphor about the layers, and that doesn't matter how many layers, and it's kind of brings our modern day metaphor of Zoom. Studying Torah on Zoom, doesn't matter how remote we are, whether we're in Israel, which some of us will be, and or here, like in Greenwich or other states, it's still we're still touching a divine. This is more of a comment. It's just very beautiful.
Very good. Yes.
And the third, I mean that's why we're very grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you.
To study. And the third question I was struggling with since the very beginning of the talk is how could the great-grandchildren of Hasidim after the revolution kill the Torah altogether, knowing that their great-grandfathers studied Tanya, and that is the essence of godly soul, that is the essence of what it means to be human, and they cut off Torah completely from generations to come. So that's the question. I couldn't not address that, because it just couldn't help but thinking. I know it's one of the garments, but I couldn't stop thinking about that.
So the answer to that question is I don't know, but I would say that also the people who came back to Judaism, especially in the Soviet Union with Chabad, it's also by the inspiration of the Tanya. As you have a story in your family, and I have a story and there's a famous story about a Russian scientist whose name is Professor Bronover. I don't remember where. He migrated to Israel in the 70s, and he has a whole story how he became close to Judaism because he went into the synagogue in Moscow and he saw them reading Tanya, and he was fascinated. So the short answer to your question is I don't know. In other words, there was a lot of challenges, and people were looking. Sometimes you have a treasure, but you don't know that you have a treasure until you come to the other side of the world and you come home, and then you realize that you have a treasure. So
or you don't realize until you actually lose it, and you see the consequences of that, which we're still struggling with. I don't know, some descendants still struggling with, because it's very difficult. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Go ahead, Bob.
Good morning, Rabbi, and Asher Koach once again. Beautiful drash, and I hope everybody is well in this time of Omicron. If it hasn't gotten out to Greenwich, the Omicron virus is marching, so beware, be careful. The numbers are going up. Now, my question is more of an observation. Trust me, I'm all in on all of this, but if I were a true cynic and looked at Judaism and Tanya specifically, I might argue that the Tanya is like the greatest lawyer you could ever have, meaning that they were willing to argue every side of every question. It's like a great debate team, meaning pro and con. So the metaphor is water from up to down, but the fire is great because it goes from bottom to up. The wilderness is great because it allows you to get spiritually connected, but the land of Canaan is better because you're engaged in a village. Spiritual is great, but physical is better. I mean, so I guess the observation is that it's great to be the Tanya because you're arguing both sides, and it's impossible to disagree with anything you say.
Right. That's very well put. So it's interesting that a lot of times when you study the Kabbalah, there's a certain danger of studying the Kabbalah. What's the danger of studying the Kabbalah? That's why they say don't study Kabbalah till you're 40. The danger is that because we're talking about ideas that are mystical, right? So mystical knowledge, it's mystical if it's a secret, if it's undefined, then anybody could interpret it any way they want. And then the question is, does it have any meaning at all? And if anything is up for interpretation, and you could say anything about anything, right? So what's the meaning? So it's nice, it's poetry, but it's not what we would call what you would think about in a religion, talking about truth. And truth is trying to come to some objective knowledge.
Exactly.
Now we're postmodern, so I don't know if there is truth, but I would imagine that Judaism, at least most people believe that, not everybody, but in other words, even some people who practice Judaism think of postmodern Judaism. But I'm not going to go there. I'm going to say let's assume that there is a truth, and we have to and we're bound by the rules of the game. You can't just come and say anything you want. So that's the danger of the Kabbalah, because the Kabbalah, since it's so mystical and so undefined, you could say whatever you want. So it's a nice drash, like you say, it's a nice thesis. But how could we test if it actually stands up to the test, to even internal logic? Is there rules that we're playing by, or could you just say anything? So
exactly my observation.
Yes. So now I'm going to try to address that. I'm going to try, but I'm biased. So you have to be careful with me, with my opinion, because I'm biased here. But at least I put my biases out. That's the danger of Kabbalah. And that's why historically Kabbalah caused a certain amount of damage, especially if you go back to Shabtai Tzvi, right? Shabtai Tzvi, a lot of this was Kabbalistic knowledge. They took the idea of the falling of the sparks that we're going to discuss later, and say, oh, so there's sparks of good in the unholiness, so let's engage in the unholiness. So let's then no matter what you do that's bad, but it's really good because there's good in the bad, and there's no rules of the game, there's no rules of the highway, and everyone could say whatever they want. That's the danger of Kabbalah. And that's why when Hasidism began, there was some opposition, because we were burnt 100 years before with Shabtai Tzvi. What is the idea of the Hasidic movement? And especially Chabad, I would say, because Chabad is logic, is that the Hasidic movement is where the Kabbalistic principles have to be grounded by Judaism, by the law, and not only the law, but also by the teachings of the sages. So you are totally and completely bound by the rules of the road of Judaism. And that's why if you see, for example, that when Rabbi Shneur Zalman wants to make this beautiful mystical idea, that when you study Torah, you're really grasping the king, you're really hugging the king. Now, although you don't see the king, you don't feel that you're connecting to the infinity of God, you feel like you're touching something very tangible and physical. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, yes, because you're hugging the garment of the king, but the king is in the garments. You say it's a beautiful idea, but tell me, where do I find it within Judaism? And Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, oh, I'm not making this up. Go look at the ethics of the fathers in the Mishnah. What does it say there? It says, it's better 1 hour of good deeds in this world than all the bliss in the world to come. How do you explain that statement? Oh, so that's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say, the more you think about, the more we know about Hasidism, and the more we know about Judaism, the more we see that Hasidism is playing by the rules of the road. It's bound by everything the Torah teaches. It's still revolutionary. It still gives you insight, but it's not that anybody can come and say whatever they want. Now, to prove my thesis, we have to discuss a lot more about Hasidism, a lot more about the Tanya, a lot more about Judaism, and see, are we just making things up as we go, or are we really grounded in the conventional understanding of what Judaism is and what truth is? And I think in some sense, the brilliance is when you can shed new light to an old idea, right? It's easier to make a new game. It's easier to say renewal, new age. We're getting rid of the old, we're starting new. It's very easy to do that. What's harder to do is what Hasidism does. It's a Jewish renewal movement, but it's not renewal by getting rid of the old or even getting rid of certain elements of the old. It's renewal by explaining the light and the energy and the brilliance of the old. But when you do that, you're bound by the rules. And that's why Rabbi Shneur Zalman says everything he's doing has to be consistent and has to have sources within Judaism. So that's what I would say in short. There's a lot more to say about this, but that's what I would say, at least for right now.
Well, the carrot has been extended and I'll keep chasing with you.
Okay. You make sure you give me a hard time. You know what I'm saying? That's your job. Go ahead, Elisa.
So it sounds like this is a follow-up from what you just talked about, but it's, I'm seeing it separately from before. So going back to the parable, when you said that it's both us embracing God and God embracing us.
Yeah.
So is that saying that God is embracing us no matter what our garments are? So if we're not 100% there.
No. We're saying when we engage in the Torah and the mitzvot, God is embracing us. Okay. And we'll talk about that next week. I don't want to get into us, God, and God versus us, because that's the theme of chapter 5. The difference between Torah and the mitzvot. When we study Torah, we grasp God. When we do a mitzvah, he's grasping us. No, we're not saying that God is always grasping us. We're saying, to the contrary, we're saying when a person engages the Torah and does the mitzvot, that is when they're embracing God. Now, this is very different than the conventional understanding of what a commandment is, right? Think about this. What is a commandment? A commandment conventionally is, the conventional interpretation is that there's a need. Either God needs us to do the commandments, or we need to better ourselves, so we need the commandments. God is needy, or we're needy, and the commandments fill a certain need. And that is true. But Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, that's not the essence of the commandments. That's not why God created the Torah and the mitzvah. That's not what it is, because there's a need that has to be filled. What is the mitzvah? What is the Torah? It's an opportunity to have a relationship with God. And every mitzvah is an opportunity to connect to God. So why am I putting on tefillin? Because God needs the tefillin? No. Because I need the tefillin? No. Although, yes, spiritually there's a benefit to God and we're tefillin, and there's a benefit to us that we wear tefillin. But that's not the essential point. The essential point is that the tefillin is the way, or any other mitzvah, Shabbos candles, whatever, any mitzvah you're going to say, that's the way that we connect to God. So it's an opportunity for a bond. Now Bob is going to say, hey, you can't just pull it out of the box. So I'll say, you know something? It's in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, in multiple places, and we say it in our prayers 3 times a day, and we say it when we're sitting in morning and saying Kaddish, before Kaddish, from when we learn Mishnayos. What does the Mishnah say? Here's the Mishnah. Rabbi Hananya ben Akashia says, Hashem wanted to make the Jewish people meritorious. Therefore, he gave them many mitzvot. What does that mean? Many mitzvot is not because God has many needs or we have many needs. Every mitzvah is an opportunity to bond with God, to embrace God. So now when I go open up the Code of Law, and the Code of Law says, when you wake up, you have to do this. And when you go to sleep, you have to do that. And during the day, you have to stop and do that. It's not a burden. It's not even serving God. It's actually an expression of bonding to God. And you could actually see it in Maimonides. Maimonides himself I read this the first time. Not the first time. 30 times after I read this, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Maimonides has 14 books. His second book, he says, the Book of Love. And in the Book of Love, he says, these are mitzvot that we do to express our love to God. What is in the mitzvah Book of Love? So there's all kinds of mitzvot. There's prayer, there's blessings, there's Shema, a list of blessings, a list of things that you do every day. So maybe my 30th time of reading Maimonides, I'm reading the introduction, and he says, the Book of Love are all the things we do to express our love to God, such as prayer. And I'm like, that is so different than the common attitude of prayer, right? Common attitude of prayer, it's mincha, the sun is about to set, I have a burden, I have to stop my meeting and I have to go pray. I have to serve God, I have to go pray. Maimonides says, sorry, wrong attitude. Mincha, the sun is setting, now you have an opportunity to show God that you love him. And in the words of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, now you have an opportunity to embrace God. So what I'm trying to say here is that it's revolutionary, but it's not revolutionary in the sense that we're throwing out the rules of the highway and making up our own rules. It's the same Judaism, it's the same truth, but it's bringing a deeper dimension into that truth. Revealing a deeper dimension of the truth. So how did we get here? Because you asked about the embrace. Every mitzvah is an opportunity for either us to embrace God or God to embrace us, depending on what we're doing, and that depends in chapter 5. That will be discussed in chapter 5. So thank you, everybody. I'm sorry, we're going fast, but listen, that's the first way to do this. So next year we go slow, God willing, in good health. But make sure to keep giving me a hard time. Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi. Thank you so much. Toda Rabba.
Tada rabba.
Thank you, everybody.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbos.